The Binding of Isaac, Risk of Rain 2, Enter the Gungeon, and Undermine. Now, out of those four, you're bound to have at least heard of one of these games, and since you're watching this video, it's likely you've played one too. These games are all roguelikes, where you essentially traverse through randomly generated stages or rooms, collecting different items and upgrades, and killing bosses. This genre has exploded in popularity in recent years, with a ton of games to play, but I don't have the time nor money to play through them all. So in this video I'm going to refer to The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, Risk of Rain 2, Enter the Gungeon, and Undermine, since those are the ones I'm most familiar with and have a few hundred collective hours of game time in. Now, before I get into it, I'll disclose that some of this is based on my own opinion of what makes these games fun and which elements I'm not too keen on. The term roguelike originated from the game Rogue, and is widely characterised with features like random or procedurally generated terrain, permadeath, and random item drops. But what really makes the game fun are the synergies between items. Some runs you might get a bit unlucky and get something for added attack speed, and then a health item, and maybe some kind of utility item, and none of them go well together. But then, on your next run, you might get a few items which when put together turn you into this unstoppable force of destruction. The games that do this best in my opinion are Isaac and Risk of Rain 2, where some items together can lead you to becoming almost a god. And the reason this is so great for roguelikes is that it adds a bunch of diversity to each game. One game you might be really heavily invested into offense, and so your game plan there is to just kill everything on screen as fast as possible. And then in your next run, you might end up with a bunch of defensive items, which help you survive longer than the enemies. And of course, you might end up with a bunch of random junk items which don't really help you much, but that's what makes this mechanic so fun and interesting. Now, a game I feel that doesn't implement this well is Undermine. Don't get me wrong, I've been having fun playing this game more recently, but one thing that's always irked me is this weird grind mechanic and the gold carryover system. And it's not just me either. I took a look at the negative reviews on Steam, and other than things which have been patched or fixed since, this is one of the biggest issues people are having with the game. As a brief rundown, Undermine starts you off by going into these mines and plays similarly to most roguelikes. There are enemies to fight, you can find bombs and keys, there's a shop room and an item room on each floor. Honestly, it feels like it almost wants to be Isaac. However, one of the unique features it has is these gold veins, which you can hit twice to spew out some gold, which is the main currency in the game and can be used in the shop. Now, between runs, you can use the gold you've collected to purchase upgrades for your character, such as more health, more damage, higher range, and so on, which initially seems pretty cool until you realise that this is where the grind begins. Every time you die in Undermine, you lose a portion of your gold. Before you upgrade your sack, that number's 50%, and of course you use this gold to upgrade your sack. Now, here's the real kicker: you don't play a run and maybe come out with 1000 gold after the 50% cut, and then go and do the same thing over and over, because this gold carries over, meaning that if you go into another run and maybe earn 500 more gold and die, you come out with 750 gold, which is less than you even started that run with. And the upgrade costs get higher and higher, so you can't just upgrade your sack so that the amount of gold that you lose gets lowered, because you'll end up needing the other gear to stop you from dying early on, and you end up focusing on these upgrades and making sure you save gold more than you focus on getting far in the run and fighting all the cool bosses. In my opinion, whether it's your first run or your 400th run, you should start out exactly the same, but in Undermine, you'll initially feel really underpowered, and then get more innate health and damage as you upgrade. This isn't how a roguelike should be played, and it ruins the replayability of the game because you're genuinely not that focused on items and synergies. Partly because you won't get too many items in most of your runs, and partly because you're trying not to lose all this currency, so that eventually you'll start each run with 20 more HP. As of writing this script, I've played over 10 hours of Undermine, and the entire time I've been focusing on upgrading a bunch of dumb stuff rather than having fun and getting cool items to mess around with. Let's compare this to Risk of Rain, where I currently have 160 hours of game time in. Take a guess which game I'd have more fun in if I booted it up right now. The game where I've experienced everything it has to offer, or the game that I'm remortgaging my house for to get the last friggin' gold sack upgrade. The reason for this is because Risk of Rain 2 starts you out exactly the same every single run, and it focuses its gameplay on extremely fun items and how they synergize with each other. While Undermine wants people to put hours and hours of their time towards upgrading their character to get to a point where they should have started at. It's honestly a shame that these grinding mechanics are in the game, because other than them, it's got all the elements of a good roguelike. The enemies are unique and well designed, the boss fights are really fun, and while the items and synergies aren't quite as good as in Risk of Rain 2 or in Isaac, they still add a bit of diversity to each run. What it loses in these elements, it does make up for in the hub world, which has a lot of interesting things going on, and gets more interesting as you find and save characters. This is something also seen in Enter the Gungeon, which has a much more bullet hell focus to it, and some fun item synergies. In these hub worlds, you're able to purchase items with a secondary currency, which you don't lose a chunk of on death, thank god, and interact with some cool characters. A great way to keep roguelikes interesting without overwhelming the player right at the start is with a good pacing of progression, with new items to be unlocked as you keep playing, maybe after earning certain achievements or defeating bosses, or bought with in-game currency. These items can then be found in future runs, giving more and more diversity and synergy options, and keeping the player involved. You could even find or rescue new characters to players in runs who may have different stats or abilities to try out. A bad way to do this progression is by forcing the player to save up enough gold to get some tiny but permanent buff. All this does is make the player focus on getting a specific amount of gold so that when they lose a chunk of it, they can upgrade their sack so next time they lose 5% less of that gold. All this being said, Undermine is a fun game, and the upgrades and grinding mechanics aren't the worst thing in the world, it's just out of place for a roguelike in my opinion. Risk of Rain 2 and The Binding of Isaac Rebirth really shine as great examples of how this genre should be done, and Enter the Gungeon is a fun and unique take on roguelikes with some fast-paced combat and gun themes. Despite all my whinging, any innovation in video games is probably a good thing to stop them from getting stale, especially for a genre that's been around since the start of the 80s.